If you have ever passed a poor man on the street and not stopped, and I mean truly not stopped, not looked, not acknowledged, Padre Pio revealed something about that moment that most Catholics have never been told. And once you hear it, you will not be able to walk past a suffering face the same way again. What I am about to share comes from a confession, not the kind of confession where the secrets stay secret, the kind where Padre Pio, as he did many times in 50 years of hearing the interior lives of thousands of souls, revealed that he already knew what had happened, and that what had happened was far more significant than the person in the confessional had imagined. The man who sat in front of Padre Pio that afternoon had not come to confess anything serious by his own estimation. He had come because his regular confessor had told him to. He had been mildly puzzled by the instruction. He was a respectable man, a man of Mass and Rosary and regular sacramental practice. He had confessed a few things, the usual catalogue of a decent man's week. He mentioned a beggar as an afterthought. The way you mention something you already know is not important. Padre Pio stopped him, and what Padre Pio said next, what he revealed about that man on the street, about what had actually been in that moment, about what had been offered and refused without either party knowing the full weight of it. Padre Pio said it quietly in the dim confessional of San Giovanni Rotondo, and it changed the man in front of him in a way that nothing else in 50 years of church attendance had managed to do. Stay with me, because the question I want to ask you at the end of this, the only question that actually matters, is not about that man. It is about you. I've seen it with my own eyes. Not in confessionals, I haven't had that privilege, but in 23 years as a nurse and health visitor in Coventry, I went into houses that most of the city didn't want to think about. Council flats where the heating had been broken for 2 winters. A house near the Ring Road where an elderly man had been alone so long that when I arrived for his quarterly check, he offered me tea with such elaborate ceremony that I understood it was the first time in months he had made tea for another person. And I am ashamed to tell you how many times in the early years before I understood what I was actually doing in those houses, I walked in with my clipboard and my professional efficiency and walked out without ever really seeing the person in front of me. I knew their name, their medication, their appointment schedule, but I did not see them. Padre Pio taught that this is not a small thing. He taught that there is a form of blindness, quiet, habitual, easy to maintain, that costs the soul more than most people realize, and that this blindness, unlike other kinds, does not feel like a sin when it is happening. It feels like the perfectly natural way of moving through the world. What he revealed about a man who laughed at a beggar on a November morning in Foggia will explain exactly what he meant. The year was 1956. The month was November, the kind of raw southern Italian November that arrives overnight, replacing the warmth with a damp chill that settles into old buildings and thin coats and the bones of people who sleep outdoors. The kind of month that is particularly unkind to people who have nowhere to go inside. Emilio Ferrante was 44 years old. He was a cloth merchant with a shop near the cathedral in Foggia, a solid business, built over 20 years, employing 4 workers. He was by every external measure a man of standing in his community. He attended Sunday Mass without fail, and sometimes weekday Mass as well. He contributed to the parish collection with generosity. His wife Carmela was involved in the women's sodality. His children were in Catholic school. He was, as far as anyone looking from outside could tell, the kind of ordinary good Catholic man who forms the reliable foundation of any parish. On the morning of November the 7th, 1956, Emilio was walking through the market near the cathedral with his business partner Vincenzo Russo. They were discussing a delivery, cloth from a supplier in Naples that had arrived with some pieces below the agreed quality, and the conversation required some concentration. They were both men with a lot on their minds. They walked quickly, the way men walk when they have somewhere to be. A man stepped into their path near the entrance to the cathedral square. He was perhaps 58 or 60 years old, though he looked older, the way that poverty ages a face faster than time does. A long coat, dark with grime and damp that might once have been respectable. A paper cup held in both hands, which were calloused and cracked from years of outdoor work. He had the look of a man who had not always been where he was, the posture of someone still carrying the memory of having stood upright in a different life. He said, "Please, signore, I haven't eaten since yesterday." Emilio Ferrante did not stop. He did not slow his pace. He turned to Vincenzo, and he said something. The witnesses who were nearby, a woman at a vegetable stall, a boy delivering bread, did not catch the exact words, but they saw the expression on Emilio's face when he said it, and they saw Vincenzo's response, which was a short laugh. And they saw the beggar's face when the words reached him, whatever they were, as the two men walked past without breaking stride. The beggar lowered his eyes and shuffled to the side of the path. He did not ask anyone else that morning. He went back to the doorway near the church of San Francesco and sat down on the cold stone and did not speak again until the afternoon. That was the entire incident. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds. 3 weeks later, Emilio Ferrante sat in the confessional of the cathedral parish with his regular confessor, Father Renato Caputo. He confessed impatience with a worker who had made a costly error. He confessed a minor dishonesty in a negotiation, inflated a price, knew the buyer couldn't verify it, felt a residue of discomfort afterward. He confessed some sharpness toward Carmela over something domestic that didn't merit the tone he had used. Then he said, almost as a continuation of the same sentence, "And I was probably too direct with a beggar in the market, but these people have to be told, otherwise..." Father Renato Caputo stopped him. He did not explain. He did not list reasons. He looked at Emilio for a moment and then said, with the careful precision of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, "I want you to go to San Giovanni Rotondo. I want you to speak to Padre Pio. And when you do, I want you to tell him specifically about the beggar." Emilio looked at his confessor. "Father, it was nothing." Father Renato said, "Yes, I know that is what you think." That was all. Emilio accepted the instruction the way a man accepts an unusual request from a doctor he trusts, with some puzzlement and some mild resistance and ultimately compliance, because the person asking knows more about the situation than he does. He made the journey to San Giovanni Rotondo in the second week of December 1956. The wait was long, as it always was. Pilgrims came from across Italy and beyond, and Padre Pio's confessor's hours were rationed and unpredictable. Emilio spent 2 days in San Giovanni Rotondo. He attended the Mass that Padre Pio celebrated each morning. This was, by all accounts, an experience that prepared you for whatever came next, because the Mass Padre Pio said was not something you could observe without being changed by it. The concentration, the obvious physical pain, given the wounds in his hands, the sense that the man at the altar was simultaneously present in the church and present somewhere else, somewhere that the rest of the congregation could not follow. On the afternoon of the second day, Emilio entered the confessional. He began with the usual things: the impatience, the dishonesty in the negotiation, the sharpness toward Carmela. He confessed carefully and fully. Padre Pio listened in the particular silence that people who had been to him described as unlike any other silence. Attentive, complete, the silence of a person giving the whole of themselves to what they are hearing. Then Emilio reached the beggar. "And there was a man in the market in Foggia," he began. "I was probably too sharp with him, but..." Padre Pio said, "Tell me about him." Emilio paused. "He was a beggar. He approached me in the street. I was with a colleague. We were discussing business, and..." Padre Pio said, "Describe the man." Emilio described him. The long coat, the paper cup, The calloused hands, the age, the posture. He described it accurately because he had, without realizing it, looked at the man carefully enough to retain these details, the way you notice things your conscious mind has decided not to process. When he finished, Padre Pio was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The man's name is Giovanni Palumbo." Emilio had not known the man's name. He had not asked it. Padre Pio continued, "Hold on, because what Padre Pio said next will require you to understand something first. Something about the way Padre Pio related to the poor specifically. Not in the abstract, the way all religious people are supposed to relate to the poor, but in the concrete and specific way that came from 50 years of seeing what other people's eyes were not equipped to see. Padre Pio had a particular attentiveness to souls that the Church had recognized as a gift of the Spirit, the ability to read the interior condition of a person without being told it, to perceive the state of a soul the way a physician perceives the state of a body without waiting for the patient's self-report. This gift manifested most obviously in confession, where he regularly demonstrated knowledge of sins that had not been confessed and circumstances that had not been described. But it extended beyond the confessional. It extended to his awareness of people he had never met, in places he had never been, doing things at moments when he was on the other side of Italy, doing something else entirely. Giovanni Palumbo was one of those people. Padre Pio knew his name, he knew his history, and he told Emilio Ferrante exactly what that history was. Giovanni Palumbo had been a farmer, not a beggar, until 1948. He had worked the same land in a village outside Foggia that his family had farmed for 2 generations. Not a large holding, but sufficient. A dignified life, a life of real work, a life with a clear shape. His father had died in debt. The debts were not excessive, not the kind of debts that reflect recklessness or bad character, but the kind that accumulate quietly in a farming life. Loans taken against a harvest that was thin 2 years in a row. Credit extended by a merchant who had later called it in without warning. When the father died, the debt transferred. When the debt could not be repaid in the time given, the land went with it. In 2 years, Giovanni Palumbo went from farmer to laborer to day worker to the street. He arrived in Foggia in 1952, sleeping in doorways, working when work was available, which was not often because a man of his age without connections in the city is the last person hired and the first person passed over. He had a son, Rocco, 31 years old, who lived in another town and was ill. A lung condition, chronic, manageable with medicine if the medicine could be afforded, dangerous if it could not. Giovanni had been trying, on the morning of November the 7th, to collect enough money to send to Rocco for the next month's medication. The amount he needed was 800 lire. Emilio Ferrante habitually carried 1,000 lire in his coat pocket for incidental market expenses. That is the first thing Padre Pio told Emilio, and Emilio sat very still in the confessional and felt a specific sensation that people who have been to confession with Padre Pio described in consistent terms, the sensation of the floor giving way slightly beneath whatever story about yourself you'd been standing on. But Padre Pio was not finished. He told Emilio what Giovanni had done that morning before going to the market. Giovanni Palumbo woke before dawn on the 7th of November 1956, on the stone floor of the doorway near the church of San Francesco, wrapped in the coat he had worn for 4 years. He had no food. He had not eaten properly since the previous morning. He was cold, and his hands were aching in the way that the hands of people who work outdoors ache in November, with a deep stiffness that reaches the joints. He said his morning prayers, not quickly, not perfunctorily, but completely. He said the Our Father and the Hail Mary and the Glory Be, slowly and deliberately, with his cracked hands pressed together in the doorway. And then he said something that was not part of any formal prayer, something he said in his own words, in the Foggia dialect, in the particular Italian of a man who has spent his life outdoors and who talks to God the way he would talk to the most reliable person he knows. He said, "Lord, I know you will provide through someone today. I don't know who, but I know you will." Then he got up, straightened his coat, and went to the market. Padre Pio told Emilio this, all of it. The prayer in the doorway, the coat, the hands, the sun and the medicine, the 800 lyre, the specific faith of a man who had every material reason to have abandoned faith and had chosen in a cold doorway before the rest of the city was awake not to abandon it. And then Padre Pio said, "Emilio, I want to tell you something about what you saw when you looked at that man. This is what truly matters. And I will tell you now what Padre Pio said, and I ask you to receive it carefully because it is the kind of thing that can either pass through you without changing anything, or it can land in the place where things actually change." Padre Pio said, "When you looked at Giovanni Palumbo in the market that morning, you did not see a beggar. You saw an inconvenience. You saw a man who was interrupting the conversation you were having about something you considered more important. You saw a category, beggar, these people, the kind of person who is always there, always asking, always in the way of more urgent things. You processed him in less than 2 seconds and made him invisible. But I want to tell you what I saw when I looked at that same moment. This is the part that I need you to sit with. Not because it is simple, but because it is not. Padre Pio described seeing in that moment in the market, in the moment when Giovanni Palumbo held out his paper cup and said, "I haven't eaten since yesterday," the face of Christ, not metaphorically, not as a theological concept, as a vision, as clear and specific as any of the visions Padre Pio had been given over 50 years. The face of Christ in the face of a man who had woken before dawn to pray with cracked hands in a cold doorway. He had seen this before, many times, over decades of looking at the poor, the people who passed through San Giovanni Rotondo on their way to nowhere, the people who waited outside the church in the morning for whatever was available. Padre Pio had seen it repeatedly, the face of Christ in the faces of suffering people. Not all of them, not universally or automatically, but often enough and specifically enough that he had stopped being surprised by it and had started being alert to it. What made the story of Giovanni Palumbo different was not the vision itself, it was the prayer in the doorway, the specific act of faith that Giovanni had performed before going out, that declaration in the cold that God would provide through someone today. Giovanni had not simply been a beggar in the market. He had been a man carrying, at the moment of the encounter, the specific weight of answered prayer. He was, at that moment, the answer to someone's prayer, awaiting activation. The provision God had arranged, present in the person of Emilio Ferrante, in his coat pocket, in the 1,000 lyre that was there for exactly this purpose and no other. Padre Pio said, "Emilio, when that man spoke to you, God was speaking to you through the lowest, the most easily ignored, the most dismissible voice available. He was asking you to participate in something, to be the person he was going to use to answer the faith of a man who had trusted him in a cold doorway at 6 in the morning. And your response was a joke." Emilio Ferrante, sitting in the confessional, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Father, I didn't know." Padre Pio said, "No, that is the nature of this particular blindness. It does not announce itself. It doesn't feel like sin when it is happening. It feels like ordinary good sense. It feels like the reasonable management of a busy morning, and that is what makes it dangerous." Now I have to stop here and tell you something that surprised me enormously when I first understood it. Something about the specific theological weight of what Padre Pio was describing. He was not talking primarily about the harm done to Giovanni Palumbo, although that harm was real. the medicine not sent, the faith of a morning prayer not answered in the way it had been arranged to be answered, the dignity of a man ground a little lower by a contemptuous remark from someone who did not know his name. That harm was real, and it mattered, but Padre Pio was focused on something else. He was focused on what happened to Emilio's soul in that moment. He said, "The contempt for the suffering face, the casual dismissal of the person who holds out a cup, is not merely an act of unkindness, it is a specific act of spiritual blindness. And like all habits, it builds. Each time you make someone invisible, each time you walk past the face of suffering and do not acknowledge that it is a face, the capacity to see diminishes slightly. The eyes of the soul adjust to the darkness. And after 20, 30 years of this, a man can sit in Mass every Sunday and receive communion and say his rosary faithfully and have genuinely closed himself off from the most fundamental encounter the faith offers. The encounter with God in the face of the person who has nothing. Silence. Silence. God. That is what Padre Pio was saying. By walking past Giovanni Palumbo without acknowledgement, Emilio had walked past God. Not by rejecting God explicitly, not by refusing the faith or the sacraments or any of the formal structures of Catholic life, but by systematically excluding the face of the poor from the category of faces that deserved his attention. He had excluded God from the widest channel through which God most commonly seeks to enter a life. Matthew 25 verse 40, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Padre Pio did not quote this verse to Emilio. He did not need to. He showed him the living reality of it instead. Let me tell you something about this that I didn't understand until I was well past 50. When I was a health visitor in Coventry in the late 1980s, there was an elderly man who stood outside Coventry Cathedral most mornings with a paper cup. His name was Arthur. I know that now because I eventually stopped and asked. But for 3 years, not 1 week, not 1 month, 3 years, I walked past Arthur on my way to the car park every Wednesday morning. I had a circuit that took me past the cathedral. I saw him every week. I saw the same coat, the same cup, the same position near the south door. I did not stop. Not because I was hostile, not because I was particularly busy, not because I had made a decision not to stop. It had never become a decision. It was simply the default. He had become part of the background, the way a piece of furniture in a familiar room becomes invisible because you have looked at it too many times without looking at it. The morning I finally stopped was a Wednesday in October 1991. I was running early for once. I don't know why that made the difference. Perhaps it was simply that the usual excuse, the implicit "I don't have time for this," was unavailable. I stopped and said, "Good morning, I'm Margaret. I walk past here every week and I realize I've never said hello." He looked up at me with an expression that took me a moment to interpret. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like recognition. Like someone who had been waiting for something for a long time and had mostly stopped expecting it to arrive. And then it arrived. His name was Arthur Whitmore. He had been a steel worker. He had a daughter in Leamington who he saw twice a year. He drank his tea with 2 sugars, and he had a very particular opinion about the Coventry City Football Club that I would not have been able to predict from looking at him. I spent 9 minutes talking to Arthur Whitmore on that Wednesday morning. I was late to my first appointment. It was, I am quite certain now, the most useful 9 minutes I spent that week. What Padre Pio was teaching Emilio Ferrante was not primarily that he should give money to beggars, though that was part of it. He was teaching him about a habit of vision, about what it costs the soul to systematically render certain faces invisible, and about what it might gain if those faces were allowed back into focus. He said to Emilio, and this is recorded in the account that Emilio dictated to his son, Mario, in 1978, 22 years after the confession, he said, "The mercy that God shows to you in the confessional is the same mercy you are being asked to show to the face in the cup. Not the same amount. God's mercy has no limit and yours does. but the same quality, the quality of seeing what is actually there and responding to what you see. Now, Padre Pio then told Emilio what to do, and this is the practical teaching I want to give you today. Not just as a nice idea to take away, but as a concrete practice that Padre Pio prescribed for a specific condition that, I suspect, many of us share with Emilio Ferrante. But before I tell you what he said, I want to pause and acknowledge something. You have just received, in the past several minutes, something that most of us never encounter in quite this form. Not just a story about a cloth merchant from Foggia, but a specific revelation about the spiritual weight of a moment that looks, from outside, like nothing. Like 8 seconds of ordinary street noise. The super thanks button below this video is not a formality. It is how this kind of teaching keeps traveling to the souls who need it. The people who are in the middle of their own Wednesday morning, walking past their own Arthur Whitmore with their own clipboard and their own implicit, "I don't have time for this." If this has reached you, help it reach the next person. Because these souls are waiting. They are standing outside cathedrals with paper cups, and they are waiting. And the provision God arranged for them is, in some cases, in your coat pocket right now. You are not just a viewer, you are a guardian of this transmission. Now, what Padre Pio told Emilio to do. He gave him 5 instructions, not 5 general principles, 5 specific, concrete, actionable things that Emilio was to do, beginning within the next 3 days. The first instruction was to find Giovanni Palumbo. Padre Pio knew where Giovanni slept, the doorway near the church of San Francesco, he said, on the left side as you face the door. He described it precisely enough that there was no ambiguity. Emilio was to go there and find the man. The second instruction was to bring 2 things: bread, real bread, not a coin to buy bread, but actual bread already bought in his hands when he arrived, and an envelope containing enough money for Rocco Palumbo's medicine for 3 months. Padre Pio named the amount specifically, 2,400 lire. He knew the cost of the medicine without being told. The third instruction was this: when Emilio found Giovanni, he was to look directly at his face, not at the cup, not at the coat, not at some neutral middle distance that allowed the encounter to remain at a safe, impersonal level. At his face, directly. For long enough to register that there was a specific person in front of him, with specific features and a specific history and a specific name. The fourth instruction was to say 3 words, only 3. Emilio was not to explain himself, not to apologize in elaborate terms, not to describe the confession or the journey to San Giovanni Rotondo or any of the context. He was to place the bread and the envelope in Giovanni's hands and say, "God sent me." That was all. 3 words, factually accurate, theologically precise, the simplest possible description of what had actually happened. The 5th instruction, and this is the one that was meant to be permanent, not a one-time act of repair, but a change in how Emilio moved through the world, was this: every Sunday before Mass, Emilio was to identify one face of the poor that he would otherwise have walked past, and he was to stop and look at it and say silently, not aloud, just in his interior, "This is Christ." Not as a performance, not as a spiritual exercise in the self-congratulatory sense, but as a simple act of correction, a weekly recalibration of the eyes of the soul. One face, one moment, every Sunday before entering the church. Padre Pio said, "You cannot undo the morning in the market. What was offered was not delivered, and that has consequences for Giovanni and for you. But you can begin, and the beginning is worth more than you imagine, because it is not only a repair of that one morning. It is a reopening of the channel that you have been quietly closing for longer than you have realized." Emilio Ferrante left San Giovanni Rotondo that afternoon. He went directly to Foggia by bus. It was evening when he arrived. He went to the market, bought bread. Then he walked to the church of San Francesco. Giovanni Palumbo was in the doorway, as Padre Pio had said he would be. What happened in that doorway has been described by Emilio's son Mario, who was told about it by his father many times in the years that followed, and who dictated his account in 2003. According to Mario, Emilio placed the bread and the envelope in Giovanni's hands without saying anything first. Then he looked at the man's face directly for a long moment and said, "God sent me." Giovanni Palumbo looked at the bread. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at Emilio. He said, and Mario reports this as the thing his father repeated most often, the sentence that stayed with Emilio Ferrante for the remaining 31 years of his life. He said, "I knew someone was coming. I asked him this morning and I knew." Mario Ferrante said that his father came home that evening a different weight than he had left. Not lighter exactly, more like a man who has set down a thing he didn't know he was carrying. The Sunday practice, the one face, the silent recognition, Emilio maintained for the rest of his life. He died in 1987 at age 75, having gone to Sunday Mass every week without a single exception, and never once having walked in without first stopping at whatever face was outside or nearby, or anywhere along the route from home to church. His son Mario described it as, "My father became a man who saw people." That sounds like such a small thing, but if you knew him before and knew him after, you would understand that it was not small at all. Now I want to talk to you about what this actually means for your life this week, not in the abstract, practically. Most of us are Emilio Ferrante in some form. Most of us are not cruel people. We do not go out of our way to harm the poor or to diminish the dignity of suffering people. We would be horrified if someone described us that way. We are people of faith, people of regular sacramental practice, people who believe in what the Church teaches about the dignity of every human person. And most of us have also developed over years a habit of peripheral vision when it comes to suffering, a way of registering certain faces, the man with the sign, the woman outside the supermarket, the figure in the doorway, without actually seeing them, processing them as background without allowing them to become foreground, not out of malice, out of the accumulated self-protective habits of a busy life. Padre Pio taught that this habit, quiet, invisible, morally unremarkable, is one of the most significant closures of the soul available to us, because it is the closure of the primary channel through which God most consistently seeks entry. Matthew 25 is not a metaphor. It is not a theological poetry reading to enjoy and then put down. It is a description of how God actually moves in the world. Padre Pio had seen it with his own eyes, in the market of 100 towns, in the doorways of churches across southern Italy, in 50 years of watching the poor hold out their cups toward the passing crowds. He had seen God in those cups. He had seen the refusal of those cups. And he had seen, in confession after confession, the accumulated spiritual damage in the souls of people who had made the refusal their default, without ever noticing they had chosen it. So here is the practice. Not mine, Padre Pio's. Between today and next Sunday, before you walk into Mass, identify one face outside the church, or along the route to the church, or anywhere in the last 10 minutes of your approach, that you would normally have processed as background. One face. Not every face. One. Stop. Look at it directly, long enough to register that it is a specific person with a specific history and a specific interior life. Say, silently, in your interior, "This is Christ." Then go into Mass. That is all. That is the beginning of what Padre Pio prescribed for Emilio Ferrante, adapted for those of us who are not starting from a moment of contempt, but from the simpler condition of habitual invisibility. If you have money in your pocket that can spare some of itself for that face without damaging your family, then the bread and the envelope are optional additions. But the seeing comes first. The acknowledgement comes first. The 3 words in your interior come first, because without the seeing, the giving is merely transactional. And what Padre Pio was after, what he spent the morning in Giovanni Palumbo's doorway working toward, was not a transaction. It was a restoration of vision. I want to be honest with you about something. I have lived with the story of Arthur Whitmore for 34 years. I have told it in different contexts, at different times, in different ways. And every time I tell it, I feel the same thing, the specific shame of 3 years. 3 years of Wednesday mornings, 3 years of walking past a man who had a name I didn't know yet, a history I didn't know yet, a very particular opinion about a football club I didn't know yet. And I also feel something else, something that happened in the 9 minutes when I finally stopped, a quality of encounter that I have not been able to fully describe in all the years I have tried, except to say that something in that 9 minutes felt more real than most of the more elaborate things I was doing with my Wednesdays. What Padre Pio gave Emilio Ferrante in that confessional, what he gave Emilio by sending him back to Giovanni Palumbo's doorway, was not primarily a spiritual discipline or a moral lesson. It was an encounter. The kind of encounter that the faith exists to make possible, the kind that happens between persons who actually see each other, who have allowed the other's face to be real to them, who have paused long enough to say, "You are here. I see that you are here. God sees that you are here." Giovanni Palumbo said, "I knew someone was coming." He had prayed with that confidence at 6 in the morning in a cold doorway, and 36 hours later the person arrived who God had arranged to be the answer, late but still in time. That is what you can be this week, for someone who is standing in a doorway with a paper cup asking God to provide, with a faith so specific and so confident that it would embarrass most of us. You can be the person God arranged to arrive. You just have to stop being invisible to the people who are invisible to you. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever walked past someone suffering and felt that quiet pull, that small internal resistance that suggested you were supposed to stop but didn't? Or perhaps you have a story of the moment when you finally did stop and what you found when you looked at the face directly. Tell me below. Or if you want to commit to the practice, the one face, the silent recognition before Mass this Sunday, write "seen" in the comments, just the one word. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is say, "I stopped, I looked, I saw who was there, and it changed what I knew about where God is."